Good Sunday morning to all of you as we today in our class complete our short study of exploring Islam. We're going to try to wrap it up today and deal with the questions that originally were asked, particularly about Islam and state. And I'd like for us also to consider what we as Christians can do, should do in our relationship with our Muslim neighbors. We are also going to consider how Islam has reacted to the situation, particularly after World War I, when all of their territory was lost. And rather than give a long narrative of the events since World War I, which can be quite confusing, I'm going to simply give some examples of reactions. We'll look at that in our study today. So thank you for being a part of the study. I do hope that what you hear is truth. I hope it blesses your life and equips you, and that God is glorified. Islam today, concerns, but opportunities. Let's be reminded of the purpose of our study, Ephesians 4:11. And he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry. That is a ministry that all of us have to do, for building up the body of Christ. Now, in this context, we have Muslim neighbors. The number of Muslims living among us increases. They need the gospel of Christ, and we need to be equipped for the work of the ministry because we are the ones who come in contact with them. They're not likely to come to our church buildings. Now, in order to do this, we must know the gospel. And we have a better basis for communication if we also have knowledge as to what they believe. Now, to sum up, there are dangers, but there are opportunities. And both of these situations demand knowledge. Now, the original questions that Mr. Carter proposed, we've dealt with them to some degree. I apologize if we have not dealt with them fully. We can't in the limited amount of time we have. But in today's study, I'd like for us to focus on the ones that are in white that I think we've not dealt with completely, such as question 8, question 10 about state, country, and religion, 14 about the current objective of Islam, 15 how it's structured, and that really is simply to say that the state structure that was present up to and including the Ottoman Empire is gone. And there are imams in mosques today. 16, will Islam and the rest of the world live in peace, or will Islam want to conquer the world? And this final summation, where is Islam going? We'll try to deal with those to some extent. I know we'll not deal with them completely, but at least to give some idea as to the answer to these questions. Now, before we get into it, I would like for us to consider this question: how do we know? Philosophically, that's stated as epistemology. How do we know anything? Well, Scripture says, "For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him?" And Paul goes on to make that point apply to God. He says, so no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Point is, we cannot know a person's thoughts, intentions of his heart. The Holy Spirit does, we do not. We reach conclusions when we observe actions and when we listen to what is said. But we cannot sit in judgment on anyone. Our Lord said, "Judge not that you be not judged." Paul said, "Do not judge before the time." I guess he may be referring to the fact that Jesus said that we shall sit in judgment on the angels even, but that is not now. We are not to judge a person and determine what is within him. We're not to make broad generalizations, because, look at this next point, what may be true of some is not necessarily true of all. We can find a person who is, for instance, of the Muslim faith, who is a terrorist, or he was intent on doing as much damage as possible. But to be able to say that is true of all Muslims is not right, because it isn't. Broad generalizations are never a good thing to formulate. And finally, we should think of others as we would have them think of us. This is just an application of the golden rule to the mind. What do we want people to think of us as Christians? How do we want people to regard us as Christians and the Christian movement and the Christian doctrine and the church? Well, in the same way, we should think of others in the same way. How would they want us to think of them? So that's just a little bit of a caveat as we proceed. Now, we've observed all along, this is the question Mr. Carter asked, this is the thesis that Mr. Hines in his book develops. The Muslim world involves the state. And the question is, when the state disappears, what's going to happen? I take this from a textbook that I used to use many years ago. There was a sense of belonging. Now, this is for the Muslims. There was a sense of belonging to an enduring and unshaken world created by the final revelation of God through the prophet and expressed in different forms of thought and activity, such as the Quran, such as the Sunnah, the Hadith, the Siri, the commentaries, the Sufi, the schools, the madrasa, the Qadi, and on and on and on. These different forms of thought and activity, and a sense existed that all of this was necessary for welfare in this life and salvation to come. So what happens when those things are not in existence anymore? Now, the point is that in order for this to take place, this enduring and unshaken world created by the final revelation of God through the prophet, a Muslim state or a state that was accepting of these institutions would be required. Now, Michael Hines states that Islam is based on a unity with state, which he describes as a theocracy. Here are his words: Islam is far more than a religion. It is a political as well as a religious ideology. More specifically, Islam is an ideology based in theocracy. And he defines theocracy this way: theocracy is the government of a state by immediate divine guidance or by individuals who are regarded as divinely guided. And he makes this statement: Islam teaches it is incumbent upon all Muslims to conquer and bring into submission the entire world. Now, there is teaching in the Quran to support that, and Muslims today might not agree with that, because, of course, we've seen before that there are different concepts expressed in the Quran, whether it is a Meccan scripture or one from Medina. But I think this is a general statement. Now, what happens when the reality does not reflect this concept? The reality for Muslims today is not that of a state. The United Muslim Empire ended after the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1055, when the Turks came in. But the cause of Islam was perpetuated in three empires, and we looked at that last week: India, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire. And among those three, only the Ottomans pursued expansion. After 1700, and we just set that as a pretty definite date, after 1700, political decline set in over the entire Muslim world. And after World War I, European powers took over the former Islamic states. From 1700 until the end of World War I, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles, the Ottoman Empire was in a state of decline, known as the sick man of Europe. And after that treaty was signed, the Treaty of Sèvres at Versailles, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. Now, we've noted before that when things do not go well in the Muslim world, there are usually three options that are open. Some Muslims believe that Allah wanted them to acquiesce to the West, and so they should go along with him. That is a minority viewpoint, but it is a viewpoint. Or Allah is punishing them for disobedience, and they should simply endure that. And a third option: Allah is displeased because of their disobedience and wants them to return to the old ways. And we're going to focus on option 3 particularly, because here is where action occurs that causes us, I think, both concern and opportunity. Now, I want to do it simply by looking at 12 reactions to the current situation, rather than giving you an historical narrative, because I think if I did that, we would probably find it not all that interesting and a little bit confusing, because many things have happened in recent years, as you know, in the Arab world. So let's just look at it from the standpoint of these 12 reactions, and I'll give you some examples of each. Nationalism, unity, socialism, military resistance, peace, terrorism, democracy, capitalism, communism, charismatic dictators, fundamentalism, revolutions. Now, all of these are different reactions that have taken place in the Islamic world in recent years, and all of them are precipitated by a decline. But first, before we get to them, we need to look at the problem which the state of Israel has created to the Muslim world. The establishment of the state of Israel has been a major source of irritation to the Arab world since the end of World War II. Now add that to its decline and its problems which were already underway. When Israel was established, the land of Palestine was taken from them and populated with their traditional enemies. Mr. Carter asked a question about anti-Semitism. It came about not intentionally, but it came about as a result of the Jews in Yathrib rejecting Muhammad, and it did indeed develop over the years. And that, from that event, we can simply talk about traditional enemies. Now, the primary conflict was between Egypt and Israel. The state of Israel was a visible sign of the decline of the Muslim world. And the fact that Israel was created precipitated several responses. Now, just briefly give you some information about this. Including World War II, Palestine was a British mandate. That meant that Britons supervised Palestine, and particularly in order to protect the Suez Canal. During World War II, there was no military action in this area of the British Mandate of Palestine. But there was a struggle between Arab Palestinians and Zionist Jews. And who are Zionist Jews? They are activist Jews. They were Jews working to bring about a state of Israel. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them were given to violent activity and even to terrorism. Now, before World War II, 1939, that's just the year that World War II began in Britain, the British government issued a white paper, that's a diplomatic statement, that stated that the future of Palestine would be held in abeyance until the end of World War II. No decision would be made about it. And they fixed immigration coming into Palestine by Jews was fixed at a maximum of 75,000 people a year. This action on the part of Britain was supported both by the Jews and by the Palestinians. The reason they supported the British is that the British kept the Jews from acting, and from the Jewish standpoint, they at least were protected. So they were willing to support the British. Now let's fast forward to the end of World War II, and there were refugees. As you know, it was a horrible time for the Jewish people. 6 million were put to death by Hitler, and those who survived needed somewhere to go. Some of them did come to America, such as two of my teachers, husband and wife team, who were my teachers when I was in college, wonderful people. He had been in Dachau, but many of them just wanted to go where they would be safe, and therefore they considered that Palestine would be the place to go. They began to move to Palestine even illegally, exceeding the 75,000 limit. And they thought that, and this, if you look at the last point, they believed if they settled in Palestine, that would ensure a dominant position for the Zionists. They would just come in, whether it was legal or not. Now, of course, that led to tensions with the British. So in 1947, the United Nations General Assembly supported the idea of the withdrawal of the British from Palestine. This idea was supported by both the United States and the Soviet Union. Arab members, on the other hand, rejected. Again, the Arabs would prefer to have the British there to keep the peace, to keep these activist Jews from taking over. It was also at this time that the idea of a partition between Arabs and Jews occurred. The British did withdraw May 14th, 1948, and on that day, the Jewish Committee declared independence. The United States immediately recognized the state of Israel. It took President Harry S. Truman only a few moments to sign this recognition of the state of Israel, whereupon Arab forces moved out. 75% of Palestine was incorporated into Israel, and the rest was annexed by Egypt and Jordan. David Ben-Gurion became the leader and the prime minister in Israel. Now, if we can move down to the 50s, at this time, Israel decided to make aggressive moves. They moved against the Gaza Strip and Sinai, October 29th, 1956, and Egypt was forced to defend the Canal Zone, which before had been defended by the British. Israel defeated Egyptian forces and even massacred Egyptian prisoners. The United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Nations condemned this invasion and called for a ceasefire and a withdrawal of troops. The British and French withdrew entirely under American pressure on November 7th. Now, with that just as an overview of the establishment of Israel and the concern it caused, and as you know, that problem as far as the land and the two nations, that's not been settled yet. But let's now begin to look at our reactions. Now, the first reaction I want us to consider is nationalism. What is nationalism? Nationalism is an idea and movement that holds that the nation should be congruent with the state. As a movement, nationalism tends to promote the interests of a particular nation, as in a group of people, especially with the aim of gaining and maintaining the nation's sovereignty, self-governance, over its homeland. Now, recall that is a primary focus of the questions given to us by Mr. Carter. It is, as I said earlier, a primary thesis in Mr. Hines' book, Nation, State. So the idea was a nation. Now, nationalism can take many forms. It can be extremely radical, and as it was with the Nazis. And in that concept of nationalism, the state is seen to be a living organism, to have a life of its own. And people in that situation are seen only as units, they exist only to serve the state and perpetuate the state. That's the extreme view. Now, what about Arab nationalism? How did nationalism develop in the Middle East? Well, there is no viable state, as we've seen, with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And the idea was to develop nations. So nationalist groups formed in various places in the Muslim world, especially in Tunisia and Morocco in North Africa. The Sultan of Morocco demanded complete independence. There was an armed insurrection. In Tunisia, the Bey, who was a ruler, was deposed. Bourguiba became the president. There was a similar movement in Algeria. It spread. Syria developed nationalistic government. And the problem with Syria, as far as the United States was concerned, is that in this nationalistic government in Syria, there were some pro-Soviet members, and the United States thus wanted the government overthrown. That's during the Cold War, as you know. And there was a plan for Iraq and Jordan to invade Syria, and also the Turks, who were pro-American. These are American allies. King Saud stepped in to mediate between Syria and Turkey, and the crisis cooled. But nationalism was strongest in Egypt after World War II. In Egypt, there were shortages, inflation, a decline in imports that made life very difficult for the Egyptian people. And the British, when they were in control, complained about a lack of cooperation among the Egyptian people. Therefore, they forced King Farouk, who was in one sense their lackey, to appoint a government that would command the majority of the country. And through him, through Farouk, they could control. However, that didn't work out well. corruption and inefficiency continued. The party of Farouk, Waft, and King Farouk himself were discredited. The Egyptian government demanded a change. The British military presence in Egypt was the basis of their power throughout the Middle East. And the British were concerned about Egypt's claim to Sudan, south of Egypt, and about their strategic position at the Suez Canal. 1951, fighting broke out between the British and Egyptian guerrillas. 1952, buildings associated with the British rule were burned, including the Shepherd's Hotel, which was a gathering place for British army officers. Egyptian middle-ranking officers then seized power. In July of 1952, Nasser, who was the leader of a secret society, began to rise in power. King Farouk was deposed. Egypt became a republic, and the process was complete by 1955. So nationalism was the dominant idea of Egypt in the 1950s and 1960s. The Suez Crisis in 1956 and an Algerian War, 1954 to 62, marked the last major attempt of the British and French to reassert their position. Nationalism is embodied in Jamal Abd al-Nasser of Egypt, whose picture you see to the right. Britain and France gave a notice for Israel and Egypt to withdraw. That gave them a pretext for intervention. The United States and the Soviet Union protested and pressured Britain and France. There was worldwide opposition to Britain and France, and they had no choice but to withdraw. Now, in Lebanon and Syria, the French were in control. You see, this whole area, the Middle East, was controlled after World War I by Britain and France, different parts controlled by those two countries. France did not want to give up its control, but nationalists in these areas led demonstrations and strikes. Syria and Lebanon drew up new constitutions that excluded the French. There was a civil war that followed in Lebanon in 1958, and there was a split over those who favored and those who opposed Nasser. There was also a struggle among opposing factions in Syria. This is one of the problems in the Middle East. They can drive out the Europeans, but they cannot seem to reach consensus among themselves. In Jordan, they were concerned about Israel. They were concerned about their enemies in the Arab world. The pro-Western king, Abdullah, was assassinated in 1951, and there was pressure for complete independence. British forces then withdrew from the bases in 1957. That's nationalism. Let's come to a second response to decline, and that is unity. Obviously, from what I said, there's a problem of the Arab nations getting together, and so a movement began to try to unite. The Syrians now began to commit to one Arab nation, and they formed the United Arab Republic with Egypt. And Nasser was then referred to as the president of the United Arab Republic. The Imam of Yemen joined as well. They were hoping that Jordan and Iraq would, but they formed their own Arab federation, these Hashemite monarchs of those two countries. But we see a movement toward unity. Third reaction to decline, socialism. Defined generally as a political and economic theory of social organization, which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Now, that's a general definition of socialism. And as you know, it can take many forms. And Arab socialism is quite fluid. I found as I researched this, a little bit difficult to put one's finger on it and say, what do we mean by Arab socialism? I found this quote: "It's not an aim in itself, but rather a necessary means to guarantee society to the highest standard of production with the farthest limit of cooperation and solidarity among the citizens. Arab society needs a social order with deeper foundations, wider horizons, and more forceful realization than moderate British socialism." The more radical regimes established in Syria and Iraq took up Arab socialism, and relations between Egypt and Israel further deteriorated. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, was established, and then a more effective organization, Fatah, was established by Yasser Arafat, who was a Cairo-educated engineer. He becomes the leader of Arab socialism. Fourth reaction, military resistance. Continued United States support for Israel caused most Arab states to break diplomatic relations with the United States. Fatah became the symbol of Arab resistance. It took over the PLO. There was a temporary ceasefire under the Israeli Premier Golda Meir in July of 1970. And then came the crossing. Egyptian and Syrian armies crossed the Suez to invade Israeli territory on the Jewish Yom Kippur in 1973. The Syrians retook most of the Golan Heights using Soviet equipment, and the Arabs were simply amazed at their own success. It destroyed the myth of Israeli invincibility, but was not a true Arab victory. The United States continued to supply help to Israel. Now, the consequences of the crossing of the war. The United States turned the tide against the Arabs. The crossing meant Sadat had now earned credibility and that Arab power was a reality. There was an international reaction against Israel. They were seen as a Middle East, South Africa, and the morale became very low in Israel. There was inflation. It forced the resignation of Golda Meir, and Yitzhak Rabin was her successor. Fifth reaction. We've seen all of these reactions thus far have not succeeded. So there was an attempt at peace that was made particularly by Anwar al-Sadat of Egypt. Nasser died of a heart attack in 1970 and was succeeded by Sadat. He was considered to be incompetent, but he soon proved himself quite the opposite. He purged Egypt of pro-leftists and pro-Soviets. And at this time, President Nixon of the United States supported an Israeli-imposed peace, not quite a settlement. Sadat turned Egypt away from Nasser revolutionary orientation to the pursuit of peace. Jimmy Carter, President of the United States, pursued peace in 1977. He knew that Sadat was interested. Sadat wanted good relations with the United States. He also wanted good relations, of course, with Israel. So Sadat actually went to Israel and spoke before the Knesset, that's the Israeli parliament. The Arab world protested to that, and he lost a good deal of credibility with the Arab world. But a meeting was arranged between the Prime Minister Begin of Israel, Sadat of Egypt, and President Carter at Camp David, Maryland in September of 1978. You see a picture here with Sadat on the left, President Carter in the middle, and Begin on the right. The results of this meeting, known as the Camp David Accord, Sinai was to be returned to Egypt in return for fully amicable relations. Israel committed itself to work with Egypt, Jordan, and local Palestinian leaders. The goal was autonomy and an end to military government on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And Israel committed itself to move toward final settlement in the next 5 years. Well, of course, we know the final settlement has not yet come. As a result of the Camp David Accord, whether or not there would be an independent Palestinian state was not specified at this time. A treaty in 1979 along the lines worked out at Camp David were set forth, but the Arab world did not cooperate. The capital of the Arab League was moved to Tunis. And meanwhile, Israel continued to build settlements in the area. Thus, conflicts, demonstrations continued on both sides, Palestine and Israel. Sadat seemed to be moving at this time toward personal autocracy, gaining a good deal of influence as a result of his efforts, and resentment grew against him in Egypt. Fundamentalist groups gained voice and strength, and thus Sadat was gunned down during a military parade celebrating the crossing in 1981, and Egypt did not display the grief that the rest of the world did. After Sadat, Hosni Mubarak took over in Egypt. There was a ritualistic 98% vote of approval, and there was not a revolution that followed as the assassins had hoped. And Mubarak gained back many of Sadat's enemies with a low-key approach. But the result of these efforts for peace was chaos. Arabs looked increasingly to the PLO for leadership. Libya strengthened its relations with the Soviet Union. Relations with Egypt deteriorated. Lebanon became a chaos of conflict among local and inter-Arab strife. So peace efforts did not work. None of the efforts had worked. And then the idea was developed of terrorism. That's a reaction. That's a violent reaction. Sadat had moved toward friendship with Arabia, and there was a trend away from Arab nationalism at this time to Egyptian nationalism. But Israel refused Sadat's overtures for peace, and Israel used terrorist activities in Jordan. Interesting that the Israelis started the terrorist activities themselves as a result of all this chaos. But the Palestinians retaliated by capturing and killing 11 Israeli athletes at the Olympic Games in Munich in 1972. Then Israel shot down a Libyan airliner in 1973. And then in 1988, the Libyans blew up Pan American 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. There was terrorism in the intervening years, but the focus really is on what happened in Kuwait in 1990. The leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait, and there was subsequently a rise of terrorism in the 90s. Of course, the events were that President Bush of the United States sent in forces to take Kuwait away from Saddam Hussein, and that was the Gulf War. And there was some confusion and some resentment among the Arabs because of women being in Saudi Arabia in holy places. But the result was the formation of Al-Qaeda, the camp, and the eventual result, September 11th, 2001, an attack on New York City, the Twin Towers, and Washington, D.C., the Pentagon, led by Osama bin Laden. Following that, there was an invasion of Iraq on the part of the United States and war extending from 2003 to 2008. Syria and Libya then began to back away from terrorism. Turkey was admitted to the European Union in 2005. And there's a picture all of us recall, the United States under attack, first time that the country in our territory was attacked since Pearl Harbor. So a seventh reaction, democracy, which really never developed fully, but there was an experiment with democracy in Turkey. Recall that Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal, had taken the territory of Turkey away from the Greeks after the World War I, and he established a secular republic there. And over the years, it became increasingly more democratic. One president, Inonu, opened the way for competing political parties, including a democratic political party. And we see Adnan Menderes elected prime minister. Following this idea, Turkish economy was prospering. American aid was a factor. Tourists came to Turkey. Things seemed to be moving in the direction of democracy. But just recent years, the Turkish policy seems to be moving the other way, away from the United States, away from democracy under the present leader, Erdogan. He is moving Turkey away from democracy to more of an autocracy, and he has been accused of returning to the Ottoman style of ruling. good example, converting Hagia Sophia, which had been for a long time a museum and open to everybody, converting it to a mosque along with the Kora Church, one of Byzantine's most beautiful churches, being converted also to a mosque. The next reaction, interesting, capitalism. That was brought about by oil, which was, of course, discovered in the Middle East, in Iraq, and elsewhere. Capital for oil production often came from foreign investors. The British invested in Kuwait, America invested in Saudi Arabia, the French in Algeria, and a combination of these three in Iraq and Libya. In 1960, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries was formed among the Arab nations, and that opened a way for these countries to take over the production. Meanwhile, a large investment in American capital in the oil fields, particularly in Saudi Arabia, occurred. And oil was providing unprecedented riches for states in the Persian Gulf region. The real advantage among all of them really was Kuwait, where the per capita income exceeded any Western country. Saudi Arabia's oil revenue rose to $5 billion by 1973, and a few Western oil companies controlled the industry. But the Arab countries announced an oil embargo against countries not favorable to the Arab position, including the United States in 1973, which of course caused a great shortage of fuel and caused a sudden jump in fuel prices. The Saudis did not fully cooperate. On the other hand, they increased their production. And by 1988, prices were stabilized at $18 a barrel. The Kuwaitis cheated, driving the prices down and hurting the other Arab states. Now, you see, I think the reason for Saddam Hussein mobilizing his forces in 1990 and invading Kuwait, there was a thought in this country that the reason was Islam. And I remember being asked to, I was interviewed by several news stations and several groups during that time to explain Islam. The point is, Saddam Hussein was not much of he was not a good Muslim at all. He was a very secular person. It was more dealing with money, more with the fact that Kuwait was manipulating the prices of oil. The per capita income in Kuwait was $15,000 at this time, 1990, close to the United States per capita income. And the Saudi Arabia income was $6,200, similar to Spain and Ireland. In Egypt, it was $680 a year, and India only $340. So oil was improving the standard of living of some in the Middle East. Politically, oil helped to stabilize political regimes, including the monarchy in Saudi Arabia, at a time when many Muslims were beginning to believe that royalty was un-Islamic, leading to Wahhabi rebels. You remember how strict they were. They took over the Grand Mosque in Mecca in November of 1979 and denounced the monarchy as corrupt and deviating from Islam. The Saudi troops took 14 days to subdue these rebels, even using nerve gas. So the influence of oil. But the ninth reaction is communism, which, like democracy, never really took root in the Middle East. There were no real democratic traditions in the Middle East, no strong sense of national identity in spite of the efforts of nationalists and socialists. And in 1990, communist South Yemen merged with North Yemen. The South Yemeni had become communists, but the fact that they merged with the North really showed the weakness of communism. Regimes by military dictators have had little change, have had difficulty changing into stable, permanent governments. Here's an interesting reaction. Charismatic dictators. For instance, Saddam Hussein. For a while, they were able to gain control. People loved them, and they turned out to be fairly competent. The problem is succession. How does a charismatic dictator find a suitable successor? he would have to be equally charismatic, maybe even more so. Iraq and Syria were successful to a point. There, parties were coalescing into one strong leader. In Syria, in Iraq, was the Ba'athist regime, and Saddam Hussein was one of these Ba'athists. Another is Bashar al-Assad, who is still ruling in Syria. He's been dictator since 2000. He even, as you know, recently has survived a civil war. Now, what do we mean by a Ba'athist Muslim? And here again is another fact that people misunderstood Saddam Hussein, thinking him to be a fundamentalist Muslim. He was not. Baathism is based on the principles of Arab nationalism, Pan-Arabism, and Arab socialism, as well as social progress. It is a secular ideology. But there were change of regimes in Arabia and Syria and Iraq. Sudan and Libya had military coups led by young idealistic army officers. Jafar al-Numari in Sudan and Muhammad al-Gaddafi in Libya, both taking Nasser as their model. Egypt and Syria became increasingly dependent on the Soviet Union. 11th reaction, a radical Islamic state. We've seen that with Iran. The Shah of Iran, supported by the United States, and his regime were increasingly unpopular, and the Ayatollah Khomeini led a revolt. The Shah abdicated and left on January 16, 1979, and a religious state was set up under ulama, the leaders of the community, which they interpreted as guardians, interpreters, and transmitters of religious knowledge. This on behalf of the hidden imam. That viewpoint, that doctrine is held by the Shiites. The hidden imam is really a messiah figure. That followed with an invasion of the United States Embassy in Tehran and the holding of hostages. And also Iraq and Iran engaging in a war for 8 years between 1980 and 1988. The people of Iran considered Iraqis to be unbelievers. And the 12th reaction to decline, revolution. I think we see an example of this in the Arab Spring uprisings of 2010 to 2012. Uprisings against authoritarian governments in Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, and other countries to bring down those regimes. But the movement was stifled by authorities, by pro-government militias and counter demonstrations. What lasting effect there is would be seen in civil wars in Syria, been going on recently, in Libya and in Yemen, the rise of ISIS or ISIL, and uprisings of various degrees of intensity throughout the Middle East. Well, let's reach some conclusions after our 4 weeks of study of this subject. To 1973, it would appear that the Middle East was declining, and Israel was dominant with the United States backing. But the crossing appeared to indicate a Middle East revival. And some thought that marked the end for the West. And the oil embargo of the 70s strengthened that thought. But the reality was that the Middle East is an underdeveloped area struggling to catch up with the West. It's a subordinated area trying to modernize. And the West is still exercising a dominant voice in the Middle East. Notice this as an example. The whole Middle Eastern world could not totally defeat tiny Israel, who had Western origins and support. Even oil money could not buy modernity overnight. And the question comes up, would this money from oil be squandered before an industrial and technological base could be built up? And as we've seen with these 12 examples of reaction, the Middle East failed to develop viable political orders. That is, they failed to develop the state, which is important for the fullness of Muslim life. And internal and interstate conflicts continued. Military successes that were achieved with Western, that is United States or Soviet Union weapons. And the success of the Middle East in cultural and scientific accomplishments have been meager. Zealot, fundamentalist, and dictatorial leaderships have left chaos in their wake. When the Cold War ended, it left the United States as the only superpower in the world. The question is, will the Middle East exist in cooperation with a West dominated by the United States, or, and this is a question I think we're facing today, this is a question that was put forth, will it yield to an Islamic religious orientation? Let's look at the last 20 years since the attack on the World Trade Center. No unity has been achieved in the Islamic world. Terrorism is reduced. It still continues. There was a terroristic act in Nice in France recently, and the threat remains. There are areas where Muslims live at peace with other religious groups all over the world. But there are still areas where tension continues. And there's tension between Israel and the Muslim world that has never abated. And there are tensions with Iran, Iran's tensions with other Muslims, and Iran's the tensions caused against the democratic states. It's a strict Shiite state and does not really cooperate with any. Tensions now exist with the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, which has now become a strict Sunni state, and authoritarian governments are arising, such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. There are some modernistic governments like Dubai and the United Arab Emirates. Radical Muslims, and I put this as the radical, I think we'd have to say there's no doubt that they believe in the defeat of a non-Muslim world by force. Yet Muslims, and I think the majority, live at peace throughout the world. And here's the question again that we confront. It's impossible to know how many of the 2 billion, almost 2 billion Muslims in the world would like to see an Islamic dominated world, would like to see a universal Islamic state. Maybe they all would, in the depths of their heart, like to see that. But the question is, to what extent would they be willing to go? Would they be willing to use violence to achieve it, or is it just a wish that they would hope would happen someday? Or do they want to continue in a religiously pluralistic society? Here's where we reach the problem of being able to interpret the thoughts of other people. What are my conclusions? Well, obviously, we cannot determine the conscience of another person. I will simply say that I have interacted with Muslims for many years. I've had many Muslim students, both in my teaching in Kansas and my teaching in Nashville. And I have been to many Muslim countries. I have never encountered a Muslim individual with whom I've interacted who has been anything other than pleasant and helpful and kind. And many appear then to be willing to be peaceful neighbors. But there is a pattern that Mr. Hines points out in his book where population of Muslims increases, and it is increasing in many parts of the world today, particularly in Europe. They will expand the number of mosques, the number of schools. Nothing wrong with that, but there is an expansion, and with that expansion, they reach a point of power. And in some places, we see attempts to introduce the Sharia. There are places where the law is always structured so as to be Sharia sensitive, such as in Great Britain. And there is no indication of tolerance regarding conversions. And generally, there is a movement in Islamic nations toward a more religious state. And I put this final statement in caps: intolerance always grows in the context of political weakness. Political weakness provides the seeds for intolerance. But we started with the idea of opportunities and concerns. The Quran teaches that God gave the Torah and the Gospels, the scripture, and that they should be heeded. That's Surah 5, 43 to 48 and 68. Now, granted, that's the Meccan part of the Quran. Also, between 2 and 7 million former Muslims have converted to Christianity in the past 2 decades. That, in an article by Alex Crane entitled Millions of Muslims Converting to Christianity, July 29th, 2014. The National Catholic Register also reports Muslims are converting to Christianity in record numbers. Yet, as I said, Islam is rapidly growing in Europe and elsewhere. And it continues to be dangerous for people converting. And yet, in spite of that, the statement is that many millions have converted. Well, what should our reaction be? That's where we want to lead to, want to end with. We're Christians. We follow Christ. We believe in the great commandments of loving God with all our mind, heart, soul, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. And Muslims are our neighbors. We can and must love them. And we should show Christ to them as we should show Christ to anyone with whom we come in contact. Because Christ should live in our hearts by faith. It should be Christ who lives and not we ourselves. And in order to interact and in order to discuss the gospel, we can establish a base for communication from their common beliefs. That is one of the main reasons that I have engaged in this particular 4-week study with you. We need to be aware of both the dangers and the opportunities. As our Lord said to us, we need to be as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. And as Reformed Christians, we need to remember God's sovereignty and providence. Nothing occurs in this world apart from God's sovereignty and God's providence. And as Reformed Christians, we also need to understand the difference between the eternal purpose of God and fatalism. Muslims are fatalists, and Christians believe in God's eternal purpose that works out according to his will. So we've reached the end of our study. Yes, there are things that are common between Christians and Muslims. They do believe in the Bible coming from God. They do believe in Isa, Jesus, that he was born of a virgin. They believe in the prophets. There is much that we can have to start with, but there are differences, remember. They do not believe that Isa, Jesus, was crucified and rose from the dead, do not believe that God has a son. Their concept is based on, as I said, fatalism. And as far as paradise being concerned, it is achieved by doing more good works than bad. So it is a work-oriented religion, not grace through faith. But we can and must communicate. And God can use us, and we need to be aware of that fact. Well, thank you for watching today and throughout the series. Lord willing, next week we turn to a study of the Gospel of John, and that coincides with the Advent season. And now, indeed, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.